and welcome to another episode of Circular Insights. My name is Lijin, and I am your host again for today. I'm very happy to be here with Dr. Yasmin, who actually has vast experiences over 23 years in human capital development, sustainable and innovative strategy implementation, taxation, and capital market investor relations in varied organizations, which includes EY Malaysia, PwC Malaysia, SC Malaysia, Perception Management, Taylor's, and Sunway University. So why am I sat here today with Dr. Yasmin Yashodha? Because we are actually going to be talking about something that often comes out as like, LCA. LCA is a sort of acronym of alphabets that people have been hearing more and more in the sustainability realm, but may not necessarily know much about. So what is LCA? It stands for Lifecycle Assessment. It really comes from this thinking that when we're looking at entire products, it's not just about the final product, but we have to look at the entire life cycle from the production of the product all the way to its use stage, when it is sort of like being used by people, and then in the end stage, what happens to these products before we can really know what is the impact of this product, not only on society, but on environment as well. So welcome, Yasmin, for coming to our podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, Lijin. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Yasmin, she's actually now a GHG practitioner for the ISO standards 1464 and the British Standards Institute as a GHG professional, not only for the ISO 14067, but also the past standards of 2060. And then she's a HRDC certified trainer and the special project leader for Agritop, focusing on agricultural transformation and sustainable reforestation programs. Dr. Yasmin, although Malaysian, actually works cross borders as well. So it's really great to actually hear your experiences from working in this very specialized space, I would say. Yeah.
Yes, it is. So perhaps I will just highlight what exactly LCA entails, and then you would have an idea why this should be the way forward for companies to think about incorporating LCA in their organization processes. So let me just begin by saying, sustainability reporting has become somewhat a mundane exercise for a lot of organizations. Okay, it's become like a checkbox compliance, and a lot of them tend to believe that it's an unnecessary burden that it's imposed on organizations to ensure that they are in line with climate reporting and sustainability reporting as a whole. Now, what I'm trying to say here is, especially the carbon challenge in ASEAN today, with Southeast Asia's rapid economic growth, comes with it a whole surge in greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, within ASEAN itself, we are the ones who are subject to all the climate change issues, like floods and haze and everything else. So, which is why it is becoming important that ASEAN as a region, we should try to think about how we could address these carbon challenges. And one of the way that we could do that is simply through life cycle assessment. So, for example, a lot of these industries, I think as of now, the greenhouse gas emissions in the region, they are projected to actually be about 60% higher in 2050 compared to, say, even 2010. All right, if nothing gets done. So business as usual is not sustainable, you know. And one of the clear pain point that ASEAN is currently facing now is how are they going to continue their economic development while drastically cutting these carbon emissions as well as meeting the emerging regulations. So this is one of the things that I feel the LCA will sort of help them achieve this trajectory where it will invariably be compatible with the global climate goals, basically.
So LCAs is like a tool actually to
Yes,
give you that form of clarity to know what
that's
can
right.
be done. And for a
That's
lot
right.
of the let's say people who don't really understand why this whole carbon thing is becoming so
Mhm.
important. I mean, yeah, Dr. Yasmin, you just highlighted it really nicely there to say that not only are we actually in a need to continue to grow economically, where consumption and production is
Yeah,
necessary, and in consuming and producing, we actually use various inputs that need energy. And every time we use energy, that's where these greenhouse gas emissions actually get
yeah,
released. But there's just
that's
too
right.
much in the atmosphere now. And we've
Yep,
already start to see how it's changed our weather, it's changed our climate. ASEAN itself
that's
has
right.
seen so many natural disasters that's just become like more increased in
Yep,
frequency, as well
that's
as
right.
the
Exactly.
strength of it, the intensity.
Hmm.
So it's like
Yes.
if you were in a boxing ring, not
Hmm.
only are you getting more punches, you're actually
Yes,
getting stronger punches at every
that's
punch.
right. Yep, that's right. And what's strange is for a country like Malaysia that never used to be subject to these kind of climate changes, just of recent there was a sort of like a typhoon that sort of happened back around the Klang area, and and we are getting earthquake sort of symptoms that's also sort of affecting our country as well. So these kind of climate change issues that never used to be a problem for Malaysia, it's becoming a huge problem now. So I
Mm,
think it is very important that we solve this particular pain point. And that is why I feel what LCA is basically trying to solve is on a twofold basis. Number one, for companies, it provides them the clarity on their true carbon footprint across their entire life cycle of their products and operation. And what I mean by that is without good data, businesses are just basically flying blind. You
mm,
won't be able to actually identify where exactly the emissions are occurring and what are the improvements that matter most.
mm,
Right. So that's one of the things. It's like I'll say like an internal perspective of why LCA is pertinent for organizations to embrace. Secondly, it's the stakeholders themselves. You have from your regulators to your customers and investors. Everyone is sort of being pressured to act on the climate changes as well. So, for
mm,
example, like the EU CBAM, it's one vivid example. They will be imposing carbon costs on the imports of steel, aluminium, hydrogen, cement, electricity, and fertilizers. And if ASEAN manufacturers don't reduce or properly account for these emissions, they're going to risk losing market access and revenue. So there are some studies that have been taken place where they said, say, for a country like Vietnam, where EU is one of their large exporting regions, right? They have the likelihood of actually losing about 830 million USD annually. That's about 0.6% of GDP. And for Thai exporters, it's about 500 million. That's about 0.2% of GDP. And all this is possibly going to occur simply because of lost revenue attributed to attributed to carbon costs.
mm.
So these are significant economic risks. And at the same time, with risk, there's also opportunities. So if you adopt them early, you will be able to stay clear of all these costs and you would have the competitive advantage against your industry competitors as well.
Just sort of like
So
imagining yourself in that meeting with the client, and they are saying like,
that's right.
"Oh my gosh, I need to comply with this. I need to comply with that." Do you
Yes.
have a solution? And then you as a
Yes.
supplier and vendor is like, nah, I don't even actually know what you're talking about. That actually
Yes, exactly.
contrasts a lot if compared to a supplier or vendor say like, right, I may not have an immediate solution right now, but
Yep.
I understand what you're talking about, and I have the
Mhm.
technical capabilities to solve it for you.
That's right.
That's a complete
That's right.
different relationship.
Yes, 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 it is. So the good news is with tools like the life cycle assessment and some of the carbon footprint standards, it is there to help solve these pains. I think it
Mm,
is important for organizations to take this whole sustainability exercise as a learning tool, not so much as being penalized through audit. You get what I mean? Because I think that is sometimes the issue, that they are afraid to fail or they're afraid to look bad. But the idea here is the LCA is basically a learning tool to help these organizations identify how exactly they should measure and manage all these greenhouse gases. So, for example, there's like two particular methods that they could comply with. One is called the cradle to grave, where it goes right up to the disposal stage. And we have the cradle to gate, which is from the point of raw material sourcing right up to the point where you're distributing the product. So you could start, from cradle to gate. And then once you are able to sort of internalize and see what's exactly happening within your operations internally, you could move on to the cradle to grave strategy. So the idea here is, with LCA, it's going to give you that scientific, holistic view where exactly the emissions are occurring and what are the actual impacts. And this will help you also pinpoint the hotspots, especially when it comes to carbon intensive material. And because you're able to identify these hotspots, you're not just taking random actions. These will be targeted actions to reduce your emissions in the most cost-effective manner.
Yeah, I love how you like brought up a number of themes there
Yeah.
to that can be sort of elaborated even further. Now, one of it
Mhm.
that really popped up in my mind as you were explaining that is that
Yeah.
number one, I think a lot of businesses approach sustainability as some sort of
Mm,
penalization, right? Or a
that's right.
compliance exercise. And therefore
Yes.
they run the risk of just creating a lot of reports that may actually
Mhm.
put them in a bad light and not actually
That's
know
right.
what to do about it. And then that
That's right.
urge or temptation to hush down on certain things becomes
Mhm.
stronger because you don't have a clear
Yeah.
idea what you're actually going to use the information for.
Mhm.
And how is that going to bring advantage to your company? So before
Yeah.
jumping into any tools, at
Mhm.
Circular Business Association, we always say you have to have a certain degree of readiness to understand how this tool is actually going to help you. And I love
Yeah.
how Yasmin, you just mentioned this is how what LCA is trying to give you. So then
Yeah.
once you have that type of information, that's
Mhm.
where you can make decisions. Or is it a change in, let's say, raw material choices that we're going to use?
Right.
Maybe I can't
Mhm.
change the raw material, but maybe the
Yeah.
place that I get the raw material from, it could be
Mhm.
different. Is it well, you're the expert here, perhaps also where the processes
Yeah.
that we
So
use for
and
the raw
and it
materials
could
fall.
also so it could also be things like, should they think about recycling or refurbishment,
So
which
planning
will
it
be
from the
more.
beginning.
Yes, correct. So I'm not sure if you have seen this particular article from World Economic Forum. They've actually identified that 80% of your design, right, can actually be determined from the initial stage of the waste stage. So if
Mm,
you're able to actually apply your LCA from the very beginning, you will be able to identify where exactly the possible waste stages are. So the design stage of your product or service will play a very important role on how you move forward with respect to the product that you're selling or the service that you're offering.
yeah. So if you're
Yeah,
thinking that compliance at the back end, especially with the
yeah,
extended producer responsibility,
that's right.
sort of rules coming more and more in play is
Yes,
expensive, then
yes.
knowing the LCA information
Mm-hmm.
actually can help you avoid all of that expensive back end because you've dealt with it at the
Yes.
beginning,
Yeah.
planning for either refurbishment or planning for
Mm-hmm.
disassembly, which is taking things apart
Yes.
more easily, planning for
Yes.
segregation, planning for things
Yeah.
to come back. So
Yep,
yeah,
that's right.
that's really interesting.
Yeah. So what I would actually say is, one of the real critical pain points, say, for ASEAN industries is there is an urgent need for them to decouple growth from carbon emissions. So the
Mm,
solution that I'm basically advocating is, life cycle assessments and carbon management frameworks. They are actually giving businesses a roadmap.
mm,
It's giving you an outline, a roadmap, a strategic direction, and I use strategic in a very particular way because you don't want to be non-strategic in how you approach this whole sustainability journey, you know?
Maybe you
So
can enlighten our audience a bit. What is that
yeah,
difference of maybe in layman terms or an
yeah,
example, how it is to be approaching it strategically and one that's not
okay,
approaching it strategically?
okay, very simple. When you're being strategic, you are also looking at your cost centers, your profit centers. And the idea now is don't just focus on these two, look at how it's affecting the climate as well. So when you're able to integrate your cost centers, your profit centers, and the climate impact that it has, you are able to look at how you can move towards this whole sustainability journey strategically. And the idea here is when you adopt LCA, it addresses your entire operating model. It
Mm,
does not look at the compliance checkbox checklist kind of thing, but you are understanding your entire operating model for the product that you're selling or the service that you're offering. And that's what I mean by being strategic. You're able to identify, okay, which is going to be cost effective. Let's not just do it because it's going to help me look good in my compliance report.
mm,
You see, so
yeah.
that's what I mean by being strategic because it's not going to be worthwhile for companies to pursue the sustainability journey if it's not going to be cost effective because
Mm,
then it won't be sustainable because you're only going to do it for a short period of time. That's why you see there's always a constant, it's literally like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back when it comes to these climate regulations and climate compliance because
yeah.
everybody is just looking at the short-term journey and
Mm,
understanding that the ROI for sustainability will take about 2 to 3 years. You know, another way of looking at it is, the payback is not going to be 6 months like a lot of initiatives that is usually implemented. But the way they should look at it is, okay, yes, although my ROI is going to be about 2 to 3 years, but I also have the opportunity to get new market access for companies or countries that are pursuing the green agenda.
yeah, yeah. And I love how, like, when you talked about that strategy perspective of it, just having more options available because
Yes,
you're now
that's
looking
right.
at it from a wider context.
That's right.
It could be like we said, raw material choices. It could be even
Hmm.
complete new product redesign. It could be
That's
entire
right.
business model redesign, how you engage with your customers and deliver performance. And that
Exactly.
actually also influences how you deal with so-called waste, or what I like to call misdirected resources. Yeah,
That's
how to
right.
actually
That's
bring it
exactly it.
value.
Yeah, that's right. So you see, the way you look at it is, when you are looking at your ROI, it shouldn't just be identifying your cost center and profit center. You would also want to look at it as, okay, is it meeting export standards? Am I able to secure green financing? Am I able to attract eco-conscious customers? So this is what I mean by, looking at it strategically. Don't just
Mm.
look at the bottom line. Look at all the other possibilities that you're able to achieve and attain by, looking at this roadmap that will help you measure, reduce, and also communicate your carbon footprint.
And this is sort of like the perfect timing to be doing
Yes.
something like that, because
Yep.
from the mandatory sustainability reporting sort of
Yep.
regulations that's coming in play, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
globally last year we saw, countries representing 55% of global GDP actually
That's
adopting the
right.
same standards to report on sustainability financial reporting.
That's right.
And as you rightly put, it's not just about your costs and revenue. It's also about your
Mm-hmm.
assets and your liabilities. It's also
That's right.
about access to capital. And
Mm-hmm.
that this sustainability efforts that businesses are putting in is not
Mm-hmm.
just sort of separate to the business operation,
Yes.
actually completely integral to it, because investors are now going to be making decisions. Should they give you
Yeah.
that resources, that money to grow your
That's right.
company,
Mm-hmm.
if you actually don't have clarity about
Yeah.
how you are influencing the sustainability issues and how those sustainability issues are actually influencing your financial performance,
Yeah.
as well
Yeah.
as prospects and position. So that's really
Yeah.
interesting sort of timing coming into play. Of
Yeah.
course, Yasmin, maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more about this whole carbon border adjustment mechanism that I think you briefly
Okay.
mentioned just now, how it's
Yeah.
also creating this perfect sort of storm in a way for businesses to act now?
Okay, so let me just explain on a brief sense what the CBAM is basically about. The idea behind CBAM is they are trying to protect the European manufacturers. That means they are in-house manufacturers that have to be compliant with carbon regulations. And they're trying to basically avoid that whole dumping thing whereby you're going to be cost effective because your manufacturers from say ASEAN specifically, you are able to get away with a lot of regulations because it's not imposed. So if there's no carbon tax imposed in your country, then you are not, it's not going to affect your bottom line, so to speak. So what
So
it means is,
if you manufacture in Europe, you have to pay
mhm,
a carbon tax. But if you
yes,
move your manufacturing offshore and that country has no carbon tax, then essentially you're not
yes,
paying anything extra.
that's right. So they're
Right.
trying to avoid that situation basically. So
Okay.
the idea here is now for companies, once you are conscious about the carbon footprint of your product, you are supposed to highlight exactly what the tonnage is on a CO2 basis, the CO2 tonnage, metric tons. And then there is a rate that is imposed on all the CO2 metric tons. So
Mm,
if your country has a carbon tax regime and you're already paying the tax in your existing country, then obviously you will pay less when you export abroad. So this is forcing the whole CBAM situation now is forcing other countries to impose carbon tax in their local nations as well. So that's what's
mm,
happening in. So you see, like Singapore has imposed a carbon tax a long time ago. They've had the carbon tax regime for a pretty long time. But I
mm,
think in Malaysia, it's not that we don't want to impose the carbon tax. It's very much because we have enough forest reserves to sort of, comply with the climate goals and the Paris Agreement and etc. But now when it's going to hit the manufacturing sector, having a carbon tax regime locally is going to be a lot more feasible because you would rather pay your carbon tax in ringgit as opposed in the euro dollar.
yeah. And also, I
Yeah.
think if I remember correctly, the CBAM price of carbon actually fluctuates. It's
Yes,
not
it does.
fixed, right?
Yes, yes, yes. So it's kind of like your stock market where it's pretty much dependent on the demand and supply.
Yeah.
So so the thing is, right, the whole idea of this carbon management framework, like the ISO 14067 and the life cycle assessment is, so like I'll just give you an example. There have been like let me give you like two companies basically, like in Vietnam. There was this company called, I think the way to pronounce it is Ton Dong A, where it's a leading Vietnamese steel products company. They became one of the first in Vietnam to achieve this ISO 14067. And what that means is they have basically conducted a rigorous LCA of their steel products.
Mm,
And that also eventually translates to calculating all the greenhouse gas emitted from raw material extraction right up to the end of life.
mm,
And by doing so, they have identified emissions at each stage. That means from the energy used in their factories right up to the transportation of finished products.
mm,
So you will see, right, because of this, the impact has been huge for them because it will help them identify, okay, should we be installing solar panels on the factory roof? Or should it be improving energy efficiency?
mm,
And another thing is, like I said about market access, it has given them the competitive edge internationally because by complying with the ISO 14067, they'll be able to meet the strict EU market requirements. And that will also demonstrate transparency to their customers, specifically their overseas customers.
mm,
So
mm.
you can see like a company like Tondong A, they have basically viewed LCA and carbon footprinting basically as a strategic vision towards circular economy.
Yeah.
They're making their emissions data transparent, they are optimizing their resource use, and ultimately that will be able to help them build trust with their consumers as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I just
Yeah,
saw something popped up in my mind. Idiom
yeah,
actually, which is better the in a way it's a better the devil you know than the devil you don't, right? And
exactly.
as
Yes.
suppliers and vendors whose clients are going to be facing more pressure to
Yep,
report, and in
yep.
the mandatory sustainability reporting standards, the
Hmm.
IFRS ISSB standards. Sorry, there's a
Yep.
lot of alphabets for the listeners out there. Unfortunately, that's
Yes.
just how the standards are named. Okay, so
Yes,
that's not
yes,
our
that's
choice.
right.
It actually says that scope three
Yep,
emissions, which basically is the emissions that is produced by all your suppliers and vendors, or a big
that's
majority
right.
of them, need to be in the reporting of your own
That's right.
sustainability reporting. So as a
Yep,
supplier, this actually is a great opportunity, like the
that's
example
right.
you produced there, where they've
Yep,
differentiated themselves from their
yep,
competitors who
yep.
don't know, right? At the least they
Yes,
know.
yes.
And that
Yep,
creates an opportunity to manage the
yep.
situation rather than
That's
just
right.
in a big unknown floating around and waiting for,
Yeah,
excuse my language, shit to hit the fan.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, of course. So the idea here is, you want to ensure you are, while you are trying to minimize your environmental impacts, at the same time, you'll be able to align with your country's national goal. I think most of the countries, their national goal is net zero by 2050. So the takeaway here basically in manufacturing is measure your life cycle emissions, that will lead to concrete improvements, whether it's going to be renewables or efficiency or waste reduction.
Mm,
And that will open doors to, say, for example, access to export markets or preference from clients who demand greener supply chains.
mm.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
Yasmin, this
Yeah.
this raises a very interesting question. Therefore, it's like if the life cycle assessment has been such a useful tool, and it
Yeah.
has been around, I think, even
Yeah.
since the 1970s,
Yeah.
why haven't
Right.
it been like widely adopted and just become like a
Okay.
standard sort of operating procedure of sorts?
Yes. And I will tell you now, because as a practitioner myself, one of the main common challenges is, right, a lot of these companies lack data and a proper system to quantify their product's carbon footprint. So, for
Mm,
example, it takes a lot to actually map your entire value chain and to set up a robust data collection for emission at each stage. So, I
mm,
will tell you the calculation per se, it's not exactly the problem, but it's the robust data collection, to prove the accountability of the reliability of the data that you're providing.
mm,
So that's why one of the key questions is for a lot of companies, particularly in ASEAN. I mean, we've just been picking up from the 70s, not like the British, where it's been the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s and all that, so they have been in the whole manufacturing scale and whatnot. But that's not to say that, whatever that's happening in UK, everything is in line with the reporting standards as well. But I'm just saying Asia will feel it a lot more because we are growing exponentially. And, when we were starting up to build our economy and everything else, the data reporting and the robust data collection, all these have been a critical issue because how are you going to account for every single detail? you know
mm,
so you're able to produce these reports, and you are the level of transparency is what the main issue is because they don't they find it very difficult to actually prove that the data that they are giving us is what I would say is the data that they are providing is reliable and credible. But what
mm,
I would always say is, what? Take it one step at a time. So that's the cool thing about LCA. Um, right now we have like energy grid, I mean, emission factors from databases. Say, for instance, if you don't have that particular information, you could use the information from the secondary database
mm,
within your particular sector. So, and I think that's the thing that a lot of companies are unaware of, that we can rely on this secondary database. But at the same time, I think for ASEAN to move forward, it is best for us to have this repository where we could have our own set emission factors that will be in line within the ASEAN region. So that'll be one thing that we could do, or I'll say that we need to do moving forward, so that more companies will be inclined to actually utilize those emission factors, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, the data
Yeah.
part is definitely something that's a major headache, because not only you need to know
Yes.
what data to
Yep.
collect in order to actually
Yep.
understand the impact correctly, but then there's
Mm-hmm.
also the whole sort of like technical details about it, of like, you know, the frequency of collecting that data,
That's right.
who is collecting the data, how is the
Yep.
data actually collected, and then to actually
Yes.
document all of these steps in a
Yes.
way that is transparent, that is accountable. Accountable
Yes.
basically just means you can go back and check it and it's the same. No one
Mm-hmm.
fudged
That's
it.
right. That's right. That's
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
it's that
Yeah.
that does present a significant challenge, I would think, and not only
It
in
is.
time, but you know, the effort to do it is.
Correct. So I think companies, what they could do is probably look at it from a pilot base first.
Mm,
Look at one product or one factory line. Take it one step at a time. It doesn't have to be a full-on organizational exercise.
mm,
Just so like what I usually, as a practitioner myself, what I usually advise my clients is take your top three profitable products. Let's examine those lines first. And from there, you'll be able to replicate throughout your organization.
mm, mm,
Yeah. So it doesn't have to be a full on, because you see, a lot of the ISO standards that you see, like, the 9001 and etc., it looks, and the ISO 14064, it looks at the organizational level from the get-go.
mm.
Whereas the 67 is very much focused on the operating model. So my advice is, let's look at it from a perspective of, say, on a piecemeal basis, basically, and then it'll be a lot more chewable, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That said, this learning is actually kind of expensive, I think,
it
as
is.
well.
It
So
is.
cost is another barrier that is holding
Yeah,
back businesses from
yeah,
doing that. And obviously, because of
yeah,
all the amount of effort that's needed to put in to get the data and everything, you would
yeah,
expect it to be that way. But to
yeah.
look at it in a slightly different perspective is that the more you do it, and the more it's
Yep.
part of your typical sort of enterprise-wide reporting, the cost
Yes,
over time actually reduces, because you've put in the
that's right.
infrastructure, you put in the human capital to actually
That's right.
know what is needed and how it benefits the company. Is that fair to say that?
Yes, yes, it is. It is. It is. So, okay. So, like for example, let me just take another industry, for example, like the financial industry.
Mm,
Okay. It is so important for them to actually adopt the LCA principles, although they would use a different terminology called finance emissions. Now, what that basically means is the carbon footprint of their loans and investments, and basically a bank's portfolio emissions. And that's pretty much analogous to the life cycle or scope 3 assessment of a bank. Because what you're doing is you're measuring the carbon emission of every power plant or factory or project that you're financing. So
mm,
why does this matter? Because for banks, their indirect finance emissions are actually pretty enormous. On average, I think it's about almost 600 times larger than the bank's own direct emissions from operations. So this is why, when you are adopting all these LCA methodologies, you will also be consistent with this, okay, yeah, another acronym, PCAF, which is basically Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. And when you approach, and now sustainable finance is becoming the in thing now, when you embed LCA data into risk management, it's not just so much about ethics, but it's about also managing your risk and opportunity. So
mm,
let's bring back that example of CBAM earlier. So if the bank knows, say, for example, the life cycle emission of a cement company that it's providing its lending facility, they will be able to anticipate what exactly the company's exposure to carbon taxes will be, and based on that, they'll be able to adjust their loan strategy accordingly.
And for
you know?
the sort of person that's applying for that loan, the more that
Yeah.
you'll be able to communicate, this is how you're going to manage the situation, the chances of
Yes.
you being perceived as a high risk sort of
Yep.
applicant will become lower, right? So you lower down the
Yes.
risk, which means that the
Yep.
chances of you getting more favorable terms in your
That's
loans
right.
are likely to go up, increase in that sense,
That's
because
right.
all of it's all
Yeah.
about like a risk sort of management perspective. That's that game that you're playing, right? If you're lower
Exactly.
risk, I'll
Yeah.
give you better terms. If you're high risk,
That's right.
I can decide whether I want to give you the money or not.
Yeah.
If I do give you
Correct.
the money, I need to make sure that you can give it back to me like pretty soon with a high return or something like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
one of the thing that I like the Monetary Authority of Singapore, they
Mm,
are actually requiring banks to assess their environmental risk. And
mm,
even Bank Negara Malaysia, Bank of Thailand, they're all issuing climate risk guidelines as well.
mm.
So in sustainable finance, LCA thinking will basically ensure that the capital will truly flow to low carbon projects and it's not just some superficial fix,
Yeah.
and you can see that will invariably become a guard against greenwashing, you
Mm.
know so like for example, like a regional investment funds, they will be able to develop a tool that will calculate the carbon ROI, like I was telling you just now,
Mm.
and use the life cycle emissions on a per dollar invested as a metric.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
and also what's interesting about that conversation is that
Hmm.
when you are actually talking about, banks actually having that impact on other people,
Yep.
people like
Yep.
saying, I don't really see the relevance immediately, but when you start thinking about these
Yes.
are the people who empowered certain companies to grow to a certain
Yes.
size, to do things in a certain way, be
Yep.
it how they hire people, the type of equipment they use, the type of
Mm.
reach that they have across the society, and in a way,
Yep.
some degree of power or control of how
Yep.
people use things on a daily basis, then you
Hmm.
start understanding why there's been so much pressure on financial institutions to know where their money
Hmm.
is actually going to, and that really
Yep.
translates it over down to the people who are applying. And again, that is the opportunity and the risk of not
Hmm.
knowing what this is, how it's related
Yep.
to your business.
Yep. That's right.
So
Yeah.
Yasmin, how did you get on this journey to try and solve this pain?
Okay, so actually, it sort of happened while I was doing my PhD. Um, because as I was doing my master's, I realized, I think just about during the Paris Agreement, when it happened around 2015, that was when I was planning to do my PhD as well. And I realized this environmental route seemed pretty interesting. So just to give you a brief background, like I come from a business background.
Mm,
Okay, so like I worked with Pricewaterhouse as a tax consultant, and when I was in Securities Commission, I was in the capital market policy development uh, division. And so yeah, so generally my whole background has very much been on the business end, and I always felt that a lot of this scientific information doesn't get translated in a business sense pretty effectively. And there's always been this clear gap between high level emission targets and technical know how within companies.
mm,
So that's when I realized, okay, you know what? Let me try doing this PhD in environmental economics. And that's when I saw the value of looking at even the life cycle analysis. So I'm someone with a business background and I decided to pursue the science in it.
mm,
And that's when I realized how excited I was because it was so practical, this particular tool, where you're able to combine engineering, environmental science, and business strategy.
mm,
So yeah, so that's basically one of the thing. But like I told you, why I found this whole journey very exciting was when I was I realized what a role finance plays is because I was in the policy side. And, I know that is one of the creative factors or creative ways that you can push companies to actually move towards a particular direction. Same thing with tax. So when we're doing tax consulting, you will see in the 70s and 80s in Malaysia, the manufacturing industries were getting a lot of this pioneer status and etc. So this is where you realize that, it has to work pretty much in a big way,
Mm,
where all these entities are going to integrate with one another.
mm,
And so that's when, and then I realized one of the most important issue was actually the development of a national LCA database in Malaysia. So that was why I was telling you why for industries it is so important within the ASEAN region where you can share emission factors and data. And because I was doing my PhD, I realized it was difficult to get a lot of environmental data specifically within the ASEAN region as well. There's a lot
mm.
available on the European region and the American region, but it's very, very much, I'll say, at an infant stage, back in 2015 at least. And that's when I realized, hey, this LCA thing actually does work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think like for businesses listening into it, a
Yeah.
question that may pop up in their mind is that,
Yeah.
while having a database and everything would be great, wouldn't that
Hmm.
actually be something that would, weaken my competitive advantage if, let's say, my competitors now are able to borrow the emission factors that maybe I put in the money to get studied and things like that.
Yeah.
And therefore, how does that actually work out? There is that fear, I think,
Okay.
like,
No, no, no. So, okay, how we should approach this
mm,
national databases, it has to be a government effort, actually. So that
mm,
means, okay, so for example, the way it's done in other countries is they go by the industry association. So, for example, the Malaysian semiconductor industry could help create for the semiconductor industry. So
mm,
all the competitors, all the players within the semiconductor industry will be getting the same emission factors. It cannot be an individual effort. No
mm,
one will participate. So it has to be a collective effort. And I think the way to move forward will be for industry associations to actually take on that important role to
mm,
create this LCA database. So
mm,
working closely with industry associations, for example, the Steel Association, the Cement Association, the Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers, for example, the industry associations should work with I would say, the government entities to create this LCA database. So that way, like the concern that you highlighted earlier, it would not be a pressing issue for companies to adhere to them.
And
Yeah.
also another addition to that view is, I think, like when we start looking at the competitiveness as a whole, you're
Yeah.
not just competing with firms within your own sort of country. Actually, you're also looking at the
Yes,
competitiveness of Malaysian export outwards of your category of
that's right.
products, right? So
That's right.
rather than fighting with each other sort of in
Hmm.
that small pie per se, you're
Yep.
trying to increase the competitiveness and grow that pie so that
Yep.
even if you were to only get, let's say, 1% of $1 trillion business, it's still
That's
better
right.
than getting 10% of a $10 million business. So
Yep.
really putting that into perspective, there is some degree of like ecosystem level or pre-competitive level of raising the standards that would allow your entire sort of industry to then rise
Yes,
in its competitiveness in the sort of global or regional sort of play of
that's
things,
right.
that would
Yeah,
benefit your individual
correct.
businesses.
So it has to be a national agenda, so to speak, you know. I mean, okay, so just to highlight what's happening in Vietnam, Vietnam has realized because they are a very prominent export country, right? They're exporting a lot of their goods. They have made ISO 14067 and I mean embedded within their national regulation. It just happened in the last 1 year.
Wow. And this is the standard for the product carbon footprint.
That's right. So, and other countries within ASEAN are also doing that. Thailand has something similar. And of course, China is even trying to move beyond that. They're trying to come up with their own PCF labeling because I think they want to sort of customize it to China itself, and which makes sense, because you can't just use a standardized regulation and try to comply with international frameworks, and you want to ensure that it sort of has the local feel as well. So this is why I say, it's important to have like a, for like say, for example, again, maybe since I've been using manufacturing industry, I will look at the banks. For banks, they could run a pilot assessment of their carbon footprint of their loan book, sector by sector,
Mm.
and then, it would seem very complex, because like I said, data collection is going to be a huge issue. And then you're going to set the boundaries, and it's going to feel like you're going to do it for a whole economy. But the idea here is you are also going to signal to the world that sustainable finance is here to stay. So being part of that pioneering effort is going to be something that I think all of us can be proud of.
Mm. And
So yeah,
yeah, and also this is like a perfect timing again, coming to that perfect
yeah,
storm, is that
yeah,
a lot of the so-called the difficulties that in data that we have seen in the past is
yeah,
getting really disrupted by the new technologies that have emerged in the last of decade or half a decade or so. Starting
yeah.
of course with a lot of the big data sort of things
Mhm.
that came into play. There was the Internet of Things, where sensors,
Yes.
trackers are becoming more commonly embedded into things. You're
Yeah.
also finding more sort of data platforms that are emerging to help people make sense of all that sort of
Mhm.
sensors and trackers and interacting with the data in very different ways. Then, of course,
Yeah.
automation, AI,
Yep.
blockchain is
Mhm.
sort of all coming together at this
Yep.
period in time to actually make
Yep.
it so much more possible for
Yes.
data that is transparent, robust, and has a
Yes.
so clear audit trail to
Mhm.
become a reality. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. That's right. So, like, I'll tell you, like, what really inspired me most to pursue this journey was basically the desire to bridge the gap between technical solutions and strategic action. Because,
Mm,
when you grow up in Southeast Asia, you see how climate impacts like flooding and forest fires affects your community. And you want to use whatever technical skills that you have to make that particular difference. And what I like about the life cycle assessment and why it was so appealing is it's because it's both granular and strategic. You can do all these crunching numbers of the kg of carbon emission, and the kilowatt of energy that is being consumed. But the bigger outcome is you are going to look at the big picture strategy for how your company is going to move forward or even understand your entire supply chain. So it's an
mm,
ever evolving challenge. Every industry is different, from a palm oil processor to a semiconductor or a bank, you
mm.
become a translator between different worlds, basically, because
Yeah.
you're explaining sustainability to engineers in their language, and then you're explaining technical carbon data to CEOs and finances in their language. And so
Mm,
that's why I realized it was not enough to just be an expert, but you have to be able to meet people where they are and make it relatable.
yeah.
So I decided that, I think it is important to sort of emphasize storytelling with statistics. So instead of just saying, oh, process X emits like 5,000 tons of CO2, you would want to change it to like, oh, it's the emissions of say 1,100 cars in a year, because that will enable people to see, it'll paint a picture of exactly what it entails.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I think also like recently I met with some product designer friends, and then they were sort of like challenging the notion that in circular economy is very much talking about planning for longevity, durability,
that's right.
reuse, and things like that. But what if
Yep,
the product itself was actually planned for short-term use because it is just to meet a very short-term performance?
yep,
Would it be better? And I think that answering that question, would it be better, is very much the crux that businesses have to face on a daily basis in terms of determining,
that's right.
would this be better for meeting my customers' needs, for the business to
Yes.
sustain itself, for us
Mhm.
to have a good compliance, for us to access these capital and things like that.
Mm.
But how do you actually do that? It very much falls back on the whole life cycle thinking that is the
That's right.
basis for life
Yep.
cycle assessments. Because if
Mhm.
that very short-term product, for example, were to be designed in a way that actually has a net positive effect or net,
Mhm.
it has lesser environmental impact than planning for
Yep.
durability, then it makes
Yep.
complete sense, right? Because it's just a very
Yes.
short-term thing
Yes.
that needs a very short-term solution, and that solution
That's right.
doesn't produce the type of environmental impacts in its entire life, then of course
Yep.
you would go for that choice.
Yep.
But if that planning for a very short-term thing actually resulted across its entire life cycle, a lot more energy, a lot more inputs just to create that very short-term use, even
Yep.
if that very short-term use resulted in like few environmental impacts at the back, the whole process build up at the beginning sort of like makes the it's like defeats the purpose, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It does. It does. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why there was that whole debate, I think, also about electric vehicles and whether or not it actually solved like reduced carbon
The
emissions as
problem.
a whole, because the battery production itself, how batteries actually dealt with at the end of life, how all the various
Correct.
electrical components are much harder for the current mechanic skill group to deal with, and how to get
Yes.
all the parts and things like that. It's still a big question of whether like EV cars are still better than your fuel combustion vehicles, right?
That's right. So that's why I'm saying, when you have something like LCA, you are driven by the belief that data and science can empower leaders to make better decisions.
Mm,
The whole point of LCA is it's not only technical, but it's also approachable as well, because you are helping solve your climate issues that's going to require both expertise as well as the ability to inspire action.
yeah.
So I think like one of the key challenges here you're going to look at when it comes to LC and why it has become like I said, like you just mentioned earlier, it's always been around, why it's still a challenge. One is a technical hurdle whereby you have limited local emissions data. And the second one, and I think that's the most pressing one, is the mindset hurdle. Oh, we have always done business this way, but I guess that's why this particular challenge sort of reinforces why this work is so important,
Mm.
and it's sort of about trying to keep pushing the envelope and trying to be a champion for life cycle thinking and hopefully sustainable finance for the ASEAN region.
And I want to also throw in a caveat there as well, that when we look at
Yeah.
the life cycle thinking or the life cycle process itself, it doesn't
Yep.
necessarily mean that you are bringing emissions to the lowest at every process, but it's saying
No,
that
no.
where can you make that sort of trade-off so that the net
Yes.
result actually is something
Yes.
more desirable from its,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. That's right. So that's basically it. So the idea here is, you want to have a clear vision for your future. And like I said, it's about looking at it on a strategic basis. You
Mm.
want to ensure that you're looking at your cost center, your profit center, and it's not about trying to just reduce emissions at every stage. You want to ensure that you're also looking at it from a cost-effective manner. So that will make the whole exercise a lot more sustainable.
Yeah, it reminds me of
Yeah.
an analogy that someone said about people who go hunting, or let's say they're on
Mm,
a shooting sort of exercise or something like that. It's like
yeah.
you could shoot the target like a trillion times
Mm-hmm.
all over the place and still
Yeah.
not actually hit the most vital point. Or you could actually,
That's right.
be like a sniper, just straight on that point. Boom, you're
Yeah.
done. You're not wasting any more energy, resources, or anything on it, and it's
That's
effective.
right.
So when we
Yeah.
have this blind pursuit of just trying to
Mhm.
cut emissions from every single thing without actually understanding, whether that
Yes.
actually has the impact or not, you
Mm-hmm.
could actually be seeing the business spending a lot of unnecessary money in
Yep.
things that
Yep.
don't actually matter that much.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
The
Yes.
LCA
And
helps us prevent that.
yes, it's not just about taking effort, but it's about taking targeted effort, targeted actions,
Yeah.
targeted initiatives. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I really love that, because circular economy is always about intentional, right? It's intentionally
Yes.
building in more
That's right.
good, not just minimizing less bad. So Yasmin, what
Yes.
is your
Yeah.
vision for the future in relation to this pain that you're solving? If you
Okay.
had a magic
I
wand, what would you most want to happen in the next few years?
Okay, I actually am looking at from the perspective of saying like life cycle thinking actually becoming mainstream I hope that, invariably every major business decision from product design in manufacturing to project financing in banks, the life cycle environmental impact is sort of automatically looked upon alongside cost and revenue. Because I think this way, LCA wouldn't just be a niche exercise done by consultants once a year. It would be ingrained in daily operations. So what I feel is like, for example, can you imagine seeing like in the factory in the future where there's a dashboard on the wall showing real-time energy use, water use, and carbon emissions? And I don't think that's not impossible because with all the AI tech that's around, I think it will be easier to attain these objectives and invariably try to have all these KPIs tied to lowering these through innovation. So basically what I'm trying to say is I hope carbon management sort of gets embedded into the DNA of business.
Mm,
That's one of it, yeah. And then,
mm,
of course, looking at the circular economy as well, people should, like you said, the intention is so important. So if ASEAN is looking towards that, they could look at it as from the perspective of how it's creating new jobs and industries. Yes, AI is coming into play, but, if you are going to be a leader in circular innovations, just imagine like every major city in ASEAN having state-of-the-art recycling and composting facilities or industrial symbiosis parks, where one factory's waste is another's raw material kind of thing. And, probably even create circular economy zones. These are particular cool things that I think life cycle assessment will be very crucial in these kind of transitions, actually.
yeah,
Yeah.
and if the listeners of this podcast are interested to look at the position paper that was recently produced by Circular Business Association, of which Dr. Yasmin was a big contributor towards as well,
Yeah.
we actually wrote the position paper specifically for e-waste and circular economy. And we have a video as well that was recorded to show how many different types of players could potentially be involved to creating a much more circular ecosystem for electronics
Yep.
and electrical items, so that
Mm-hmm.
the problem of e-waste wouldn't even emerge in the first place. For examples, as what building on what Dr. Yasmin has shared just now, even the way that we treat the not the recovery, but the extraction of parts within our electrical and electronic assets is another area of, specialization that we really haven't been looking at very sort of like sufficiently. There's a lot probably done in certain sectors like the airlines of sectors or the automobile sectors, but the vast diversity of electrical and electronic items, I think at this point, even talking about recycling is still in a simple recycling of crushing and extracting back the raw materials rather than actually extracting very specific components or very specific parts that can be put back into remanufacturing straight on. So it's interesting to actually see how the life cycle thinking enables us to see these different opportunities whereby more things could actually be happening in order to capture the value, in order to provide jobs that are meaningful, and at the same time making the best use of whatever resources we've already put in to every product existing already.
Yeah.
Right.
And I just want to highlight another thing, this integration of carbon management in finance and in policy. I think sustainable finance is going to invariably become the default mode of finance because, as you can see, we actually have our ASEAN's own taxonomy for sustainable finance, and that explicitly calls for calculating life cycle emissions. And, using standards like the ISO 14067 and 64 to classify this green investment would mean that, a power plant or a factory won't be considered green just because it's efficient in one part, but it needs to be low carbon throughout its life cycle. So that's why it is important that, because even the stock exchanges in ASEAN, invariably, like in 2026, they could require listed companies to publish audited carbon footprints or even product carbon labels. So as opposed to waiting for the regulators to knock on the door, you might as well take on this initiative and look forward to growing through this whole process in a seamless way. It's never going to be a rush because of regulatory requirements that is being imposed. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'll throw in a bit of a thing there as well to like say that it's good to join in when it's a bit of a Wild West, because people are going to be a bit more
Yes.
forgiving. Everyone's in a
Correct.
learning stage. By the time
That's
regulators are
right.
knocking on your doors, you'll be finding yourself in a much more sort of less forgiving situation.
Exactly.
And you
That's
are going
right.
to be a follower and not really be able to push, I guess,
Yeah.
the horizons in your favor. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
So,
really
and you know, and I think this whole life cycle impact, it's going to spur a wave of innovation across ASEAN as well. Because I think when companies and entrepreneurs start looking at problems through an LCA lens, they will realize there's a lot more opportunity than risk. You know, so if waste management is a big emission issue, you could see a lot of startups like, you know, trying to turn agricultural waste into biofuels or bioplastics, or using AI to optimize supply chains for lower carbon miles. You know,
mm,
so if a product use phase is carbon heavy, then driving that innovation for energy efficient appliances and trying to tailor it to local markets, this could be something that could flourish within the ASEAN region as well.
yeah. So, for example,
Yeah.
like a number of not departmental stores, those grocery stores of sorts. Here in the UK, there's been an example whereby, if I correctly remember, Marks and Spencers actually
Mm-hmm.
invested into the technology to measure how fast various consumable foods in their sort of fridges, sandwiches, and all of that were actually being sold off, and then they
Right.
would, before the end of the day, redistribute wherever food is necessary, so that they could actually reduce the amount of food waste coming out from these the overall stores that they have. Not
Yeah.
only from a societal perspective, it gave them a
Mm-hmm.
lot of credibility, but also from the environmental perspective as well, because food waste and the emissions that's related to food waste is humongous. So for stores like this, you know, it makes the decision a bit easier to invest in that technology to monitor the flow of your stock and the redistribution of your stock in a timely manner, so that all of it gets sold off. Of course, from the business sense, it also means that they were able to recover more
Mm-hmm.
business revenue compared to just throwing everything away,
Yeah.
of unsold stock and things like that. So yeah, that's a really interesting thing. Also wanted to add in there that there's been two other developments in the finance side, which Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Yasmin actually already hinted towards, apart from what's happening in ASEAN for the harmonized of sustainability taxonomy. Europe and
Mm-hmm.
China already have a harmonized green taxonomy, and Singapore
Yeah.
last year also began coordinating the multi-jurisdictional green taxonomy, which means that the financing institutions will have more common sort of understanding of what terms mean. And when projects are applying under those terms, they would be able to get cross-border funding and things like that much more easily than before. Another development we've seen as well is the harmonized guidelines for circular economy finance. It's been launched this year by the International Finance Corporation. So for companies where you are already solving these challenges in sustainability through a circular economy lens, do check out that guidelines, because that is what is being communicated to bankers, to investors, to qualify you as a circular business. And what I love about it, it actually tells you the types of examples of indicators that banks may be requesting from you to prove that your business is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. And a lot of these indicators, I believe, can be answered through a LCA process.
Yep, that's right. And you know, perhaps, you know, as we move forward, having regional collaborations are going to be so important. You know, having that strong collaboration within ASEAN and this agenda, or having like an ASEAN Center for Energy or joint ASEAN climate initiatives, which I think it's already available now. And probably from this perspective, we could come up even with an ASEAN carbon label or certification, kind of like what's happening in China, but we could do it for the ASEAN region itself, which can be independently verified, because this will harmonize efforts. And remember, like how you said about the cost issue for a lot of SMEs, right? When you have an ASEAN-wide database of emission factors, everyone will be able to adopt the LCA with locally relevant data, and the expert will just be there to help the SMEs to adopt the LCA. So you'll be able to even tackle all these transboundary issues as well. you know, and yeah, so that's one of the things that we could actually look forward to, I hope, I think, you know, and truly leapfrog onto the whole sustainable path, basically.
After all, ASEAN is still a very big powerhouse in terms of the global manufacturing.
Correct.
So,
That's right.
where do people find you, Dr. Yasmin, especially now you've shared your vision of the future and what you believe needs to be done? If people would like to be part of that journey to further your mission, or they would like to work with you on product carbon footprints and LCAs, how can they
Okay.
find you?
Basically, I'm all good for like-minded collaborators. You know, if you're a company in need of guidance or investor seeking insight or policymaker drafting climate strategies, you can just find me on LinkedIn, you know, or you want me to just spread awareness. I believe, you know, you can find me on LinkedIn because I pretty much share all my insights there. And at the same time, you know, I encourage all listeners, please don't hesitate to reach out with just even random questions, ideas, because even if you're just at the brainstorming stage, you have an idea, I'd like to discuss it because part of my mission is also education. And I do short introductory calls or talks for teams to help them seed these ideas as well. So yeah,
Right. Thank you
yep.
very much, Dr.
Yeah,
Yasmin, for
LinkedIn will
that.
be one of the best places. Yeah.
We will definitely drop your LinkedIn link in the description of this podcast. So you
Yep.
can go and check below for the link to reach out to Dr. Yasmin. So, right. Thanks very much,
Okay.
Dr. Yasmin, for your time. It was
Okay.
great having this conversation with you. Any last thoughts that you'd like to say?
No, I think what people need to look at is, you know, LCA and circular economy is pretty much the two sides of the same coin.
Mm.
Circular economy gives you the vision of no waste. LCA gives you the metrics to achieve it efficiently.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much
Yeah.
for that very nice closing statement. And for the
All right.
audiences who tuned in with us today, thank you for listening to the end. If you're interested to find out more about Circular Business Association, please also look at the link below. You can always find our website, www.circularbusinessassociation.org, for you to explore further the resources and the network of an ecosystem builder solving the climate crisis and accelerating implementation. So thank you again, Dr. Sin. We'll see all of
All
you
right.
next time. Goodbye.
Thank you, Lijin. Bye.